On this episode, we welcome back our old pal Stuart McDonald from Travelfish to talk about the recovery of tourism in Asia.
So if you have questions about the latest developments in over-tourism, secondary destinations, and much more, you'll dig this episode of the Bangkok Podcast.
Sawadee Krap, and welcome to the Bangkok Podcast. My name is Greg Jorgensen, a Canadian who came to Thailand in 2001 and is finally trying to design his family crest, but has to figure out how to tastefully combine an elephant, a moose, a maple tree, and a golden shower tree, which, true story, is Thailand's national tree.
Maybe we shouldn't go there right now. And I met Kenneth, an American who came to Thailand on a one-year teaching contract 23 years ago, fell in love with the stunningly photogenic skies over Bangkok, which are apparently due to all the air pollution, so I never left.
Like, ooh, look, over there, it's gray.
The clouds, the cloud, Google cloud pictures Bangkok. There's shockingly cool pictures of Bangkok skies.
Really?
And
well, there is, but
no,
right
I think I don't know about it right now, but I think it's due to air pollution. Like there's just crazy colors, trust me, Bangkok skies, maybe Bangkok skies would work better, but there's great, I don't know what to call it. Sky photography, cloud photography in Bangkok for reals.
At least it'll look pretty while you're coughing up balls of phlegm onto the sidewalk.
That's exactly right. That's the right attitude. All right. We want to give a big thanks to all of our patrons who support the show. Patrons get every episode a day early, behind the scenes photos of our interviews, a heads up to send questions to upcoming guests, and access to our Discord server to chat with me, Greg, and other listeners around the world. But best of all, patrons also get an unscripted, uncensored bonus episode every week where we riff on current events and Bangkok topics. On this week's bonus show, we chatted about Greg's upcoming trip to Singapore and a science experiment he'll carry out while he's down there, the recent expat orientation session held by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our intense sadness at not being included as a useful resource for Thailand's newbies, and a discussion over a new patron who withdrew his support after things got a bit spicy on our Discord chat, which leads us to pondering if it's possible to broadly predict the political leanings of Thailand's expat population. To learn how to become a patron and get all this good stuff, plus full access to over 700 bonus and regular back episodes, click the support button at the top of our website.
That's right. And hey, a quick update. We didn't get a chance to mention it on the previous show last week, but last week's guest, Hugh Van Ness, has given us 10 copies of Hell in Paradise, the book he wrote about his experiences looking for his friend in the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami. So here's what we're going to do. The first 10 people that hear this and send an email to bangkokpodcast@gmail.com with the subject book will be the lucky winners of a copy of Hell in Paradise that we will send out to you. As for people who write in number 11 to infinity, well, stay tuned for the next giveaway. All right. Well, in this episode, we welcome back our old friend, one of Asia's original travelers and travel writers, one Mr. Stuart McDonald from travelfish.org. Now, last time Stu was on the show was way back in 2018 for episode 12 of season 3, talking about, funnily enough, over-tourism. Little did we know, however, that a year later, Thailand's tourism industry would be stopped dead in its tracks by COVID, giving the economy a purple nurple that it is only now just recovering from. So we are happy that we were able to sit down with Stu again to check in on what's been going on tourism-wise in Thailand and the rest of Asia. As a major part of the continent's economy, there's a lot riding on travelers coming back, but how much is too much? There was a lot said about COVID being an opportunity for the industry to come back to life in a responsible, sustainable way. But as you can imagine, your mileage may vary greatly on that idea depending on where you are. So here is part 1 of our discussion with our buddy Stu McDonald. Well, we are very happy to be talking to our old pal, Stuart MacDonald, as David Letterman used to introduce Norm MacDonald. Welcome back to the Bangkok Podcast, too.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. The recorder is on.
The recorder is on, yeah.
Okay.
Now
It has been a while. So when When did we interview you last?
Oh, it was
3 years
At least
ago?
3.
well. You got to
Pre-COVID.
add like it's pre-COVID, so you got to add like another 30 years to cover it. I think it'd be like at least 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah.
When we were young kids.
That's right.
Well, for those that don't know, and I imagine there's very few of you out there, that Stu is the head honcho at Travelfish, the undisputed champion of independent travel in Southeast Asia. Is that a good tagline?
Oh yeah, I'll pay you later.
All right, cool. Got a nickel. A hot nickel coming my way. But Stu, you've been doing really great stuff for a long, long time. You're really tied into the entire tourism industry, the market. Some would say a voice of authority on all these things. So it's nice to have you back on the show that is all about the most touristed city in the world that is not aimed at tourists. So welcome to that podcast. That's what the niche we've carved out for ourselves.
Thank you.
But tourism is a big, big part of Bangkok and Thailand's economy. It's a massive driver of money, of culture, of why we love living here, of the energy of the place. And you put out a really interesting newsletter, which everyone should subscribe to. And you linked to an article recently that I thought was really interesting. And I want to read a paragraph from it that'll kick off this discussion about where tourism is in 2024 and where it's going. So if you'll indulge me just for a minute, let me read this quote. I thought it was very interesting. It said, "From the beginning, recreational travel has been this Janus-faced straddling this dichotomy between profound and the profane, the enabling and the transgressive. But it is this dark shadow that is now ascendant amid a gathering sense that tourism's drawbacks are starting to outweigh its rewards. Inessential by definition, responsible for 8% of global carbon emissions, tourism has become bound up with all manner of anxieties about human behavior and the damage we wreak on the world around us. In places that have been overwhelmed or remolded in ways its inhabitants regret, there is growing resistance. Taxes, prohibitions, and no end of local antipathy are now as much an inconvenient feature of the holiday season as sunburn and gastroenteritis." And just finishing that off, it says, "Here is tourism's intractable contemporary paradox, that the democratization of our geographical and cultural riches too often precipitates their ruination. Again and again, tourism sacralizes the objects of its gaze, then desecrates them with footprints." Pretty heavy stuff.
Brutal.
We should go on holiday, right?
What's your take on that? Is that accurate?
I thought that was a really strong piece. Every week when I send a newsletter, I pick one particular story to say, if you're just going to read one thing, read this one. And the author, he's a very solid writer, and I thought it was very good and very fair. And when he talks about the shadow of tourism, it's for anybody who's been traveling for a prolonged period, over a prolonged period, so for 5, 10, 15 years, something like that, returning to the same places, you see them change. Yeah. And to a point, they change with you. Like you start off as like a 19-year-old backpacker, and when you're a 39-year-old person with 1.5 kids or something, you might be interested in different things. And so to a point, places grow with you. But what I found was in the lead up to the pandemic, say from about 2016 onwards, I was still traveling a tremendous amount across the region, and I was finding that more and more places that I once loved, when I went back to them, I was like, I just never want to come here again.
Really?
And it was sort of it's quite depressing to sort of see how things change. And I'm not talking specifically about Thailand here. I mean, it doesn't matter where you pick in the region. I mean, particularly in small islands where you see that it's the whole cliche of concreting over paradise. And Thailand has that down to a fine art.
Concreting of paradise.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing it now in Bali as well, as like quite literally the rice fields are being paved over to make car parks. And so at some point, just looking at that from a tourist point of view, at some point you lose the reason why you're going there in the first place. Like if you're going somewhere to see rice paddies, for example, and now when you go, all there is a car park, well, there's not much of a reason to go again.
Right.
But what the author is, I think, touching on there, and this is something that is really getting a lot more discussion now, is that whole thing has really only been looked at through the tourist point of view. So it's sort of like when you say, I don't know, like Koh Samui is now overdeveloped, so tourists won't want to go there, like that kind of discourse. But what isn't getting talked about is the local people. Like, this is people's homes. And so that's being transformed as well. And that is getting a lot more currency now, like it happened through the pandemic, and particularly since then, which I think is a really good point. And so often tourism is looked at, because the entire industry is not, I mean, it's about giving locals jobs and they make some money and everything, but really you're
giving the customer what they want.
Yeah, to give the customer a good time, you know. That's the focus. The customer is always right. And increasingly, that is a bad deal for the people who live there. I mean, yeah, maybe you're getting a better job or something like that, getting some more money. But the costs, whether it's through crime or drugs or traffic or pollution or, I mean, pick your poison.
Right.
They're becoming like you can't bury them anymore. So, yeah, I mean, there's really significant challenges. And across the pandemic, when everything sort of shut down, some people, like myself included, were really hoping that the silver lining to this whole debacle was going to be a rethinking of tourism, to sort of say, well, how can we change what's going on here so the customer is still getting their good time, whatever it is that they want, but the costs of that, because the residents wear all the costs, are not so insurmountable, that we're doing a better balancing act. And in practice, that hasn't happened. Like, the industry is trying to get back to 2019 as quickly as possible.
Trying to get back to the numbers, basically.
To the numbers. I mean, it's completely insane. I mean, Thailand came out, there was a story late last year about all the new airports they want to build. It's the same thing in Vietnam. And it's just
It's unsustainable.
Fixation on ever-growing numbers. I first came to Thailand in, when was it, 93? And so what are we now, like, what is that, 40 years?
Yeah, 40 years.
Jesus. Jesus, where did that go?
Wait, I'm sorry, that's 30, wait, 93? No, did you say 93?
93.
Okay, 30 years.
Right.
30 years.
Okay.
Not so bad.
I just aged a decade. But the thing is that Thailand still has the exact same number of islands in 2023 as it had in 1993. And yet the tourism, I mean, what are they aiming for now? Like 30 million or some ludicrous
40
amount?
40 is what they're aiming at.
Where are they going to put the people? You know?
The example that comes to mind for me immediately is a story I read recently about Venice, which is just overwhelmed with tourists to the point now where they're like, violence is almost breaking out. Like, the locals who live there, who are left, which is like 10% of the annual, the number of people that are living in the city in any day, you know, they're protesting and they're trying to put all these extremely restrictive laws in place. Just, they've had enough. They've done it. It's just the whole city's just getting ruined. And
Stuart, I have a question for you. And just because I try to relate what you're saying to my experience, I've never been crazy about the classic tourist spots. Like, I just never been that into it. You know, I'm kind of you've seen one temple, you've seen them all kind of guy. That's just my thing. But one thing that bugs me, and I think what you're saying is in line with this, is as these tourist destinations grow, to me, they become homogenous. Yeah. It's like, it does, like, I could go to a place in Vietnam with a lot of tourists and it'll have like a pizza shop, this thing, and it looks exactly like a beach in Phuket. And it's like a generic tourist destination, and it lost whatever local identity it had.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
We try to talk straight about Thailand, and to me, this is something I've never liked about Thailand, is that I feel like sometimes I go to a small Thai town, and I feel like it's exactly like the last one. It's like they have the same plastic stools and the same restaurants.
A Honda dealership next to the 7-Eleven.
Yeah, but I mean, it's especially true of tourist places. It's like they're almost identical.
Yep. Yeah, and interchangeable. And I think on one hand, that is, you're giving the consumer what they want, right? So the tourist wants an Irish pub
Right.
on Samui.
That's
or
right.
whatever, like
That's right.
that's an easy flogging horse. But you end up with an Irish pub on every Thai island, and the tailor shops and all the other tourism window dressing
Massage
that
shops
comes with it.
Right. Sure.
And I mean, I don't want to be the "you should have been here yesterday" kind of guy, but in the early 90s, if you went to, say, Koh Samui, Koh Phangan or Koh Tao, they had a certain vibe. And then if you went over to the Northern Andaman Islands like Lanta, Koh Yao or something like that, they were still Thai islands, but there was a different vibe to them.
Gotcha.
You went down to the Southern Andaman like Lipe, Adang, whatever, Tao Tao. They were different again. Now, not so much. I mean, there's still like, oh, this is a Muslim island, so there's still like a different kind of vibe to a
Sure.
point. But tourism infrastructure-wise, it's all the same. It's all there. Same with the accommodation, It's going to be a real problem because for a lot of punters, like just a typical holiday maker, they want a hammock, a palm tree, a beer, and some sand and some
Right.
water,
Right.
Sounds good to me.
simplifying, not speaking for myself. I'm much more sophisticated.
Of course.
Yes, it is. But the problem is when the destinations all end up the same, then you're going to, from the tourist point of view, it's like, oh, well, I can't go to Bali because they've got whatever, some structural problem or whatever. So I'm going to go to Boracay, or I'm going to go to Samui, or I'm going to go to Phuket. There's geographical differences. There are cultural differences. There's food differences. But at the heart of the tourist product,
That's right.
they're not that different.
Mm-hmm.
Not that different.
Right.
And I think that's a very unfortunate way that destinations have developed. They haven't sort of, to say they should resist is the wrong word. And they certainly have pride in how they live and their traditional way of life. But there is this mentality about pleasing the tourist, about giving the tourist what they want.
Sure.
And so that's what you end up having.
Do you think the Tourism Authority of Thailand is aware of this problem? Do you think they sit around thinking like, how do we differentiate Phuket from Samui, from Koh Chang? Because that seems like that's what you should do. You should make Phuket uniquely Phuket. So if you've been to Samui and you want something different, I haven't got the Phuket experience. But now the problem is they're very similar.
I mean, the TAT comes up with all kinds of ideas. They have like,
it's like the one part of the Thai government that has a real budget.
They spend it on a new app every year that's going to be the next great thing.
How many goddamn Thailand tourism websites are there?
Yeah.
Right.
Jesus. But Thailand promotes itself. It doesn't, to a point, it doesn't need a tourism board because it's such an easy country to travel in. I mean, other countries like I think of the region, Vietnam has probably had the most interesting, longer thought out tourism ideas.
Oh, really?
But then I think that died in the ass as well. So yeah, no, I think it would be a good idea for destinations to differentiate themselves better. But it's a difficult thing to sort of put back into the box, If you think about Phuket, for example, like what's its real strengths? Food, obviously, is the big one. But you go down in the tourist areas, there's no real Thai food there. You have to go into Phuket town or whatever to go and, you will find real Thai food, but the focus is all on Joe's Swedish meatball place or
Phuket
whatever,
also, I remember our buddy Dan was down in Phuket. Do you remember when the Phuket Sandbox opened?
Sandbox,
yeah, the Phuket Sandbox opened, and I rushed down there like thinking that like tourists were going to swarm back, and no one was there, except Dan was down there doing for the TAT, and Phuket actually really has the potential to be unique because it's got it's like got a Portuguese influence, and there's also a Chinese immigrant population that settled there like 100 years ago. So they actually, it's not quite the same, but from talking to Dan, it's almost like New Orleans in the U.S., where New Orleans is French, and like
that's an interesting parallel.
Like Phuket has the potential to be unique.
Yeah, it does. It has that potential. I think in all of these countries, the potential is huge. And what is one of the more frustrating things about it is over and over and over again, that potential is
Right. Right.
chucked out the window.
Yeah.
You know?
Going back to what you said about the optimism you had in the early days of the pandemic about how this sort of will reset, recalibrate the focus of tourism when things start to come back. And I was cautiously optimistic, but also really not really, because,
Right.
you know, and to quote the amazing Cyndi Lauper, money changes everything, right? Like, it's just, you cannot get away from that. Eventually the magnet is going to, the needle on the compass is going to swing back to money. And I can understand why it's so hard for them to say, like, no, you used to get 5,000 tourists a day. We're going to cap it at 2,000 and get way less money, but we're going to improve the environment.
In partial defense of the Thai government, they want, a lot of small business people suffered during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so when they want to bring tourists back, I'm sure that's what Thai people are clamoring for. Especially at that situation, it's pretty hard then to either institute controls or try to regulate it more.
Right.
When people have been desperate for the last few years.
Yeah, I agree with you to a point, but I think that it's a mistake to think of tourism as a band-aid on government's idiotic development plans, right?
Right.
So, say, to use Indonesia as an example, in Bali, there hasn't been a huge investment in education and skilling and that kind of things into any fields other than tourism.
Oh, I see.
So they need the tourism to get people off the land, to get better paying jobs and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, if you're an unskilled person working in a hotel making beds and you're 25, you're going to be doing it when you're 55. And that's not necessarily a great thing when you weigh up all the other costs of what's going in there, development-wise. So yeah, like tourism as a whole is I think the biggest employer on earth.
Oh,
I'm
really?
pretty
Wow.
sure. Yeah.
The biggest single type
The
of
biggest
right.
by industry or trade or whatever you want to call it. So there is a huge amount of jobs, but a lot of them are really crappy jobs. And we saw this in Bali at the start of the pandemic when, to their credit, some hotels and other tourism businesses bent over backwards to look after their employees, to try and ease the shock and everything, where others were like, don't come in tomorrow.
Right.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And like these are like Bali for an Indonesian person is an expensive place to live. So a lot of people had to go back to Sulawesi or Java or Lombok or whatever. And now, shock and horror, the tourism industry is having trouble getting employees back. And it's like, well, maybe if you hadn't treated them as garbage at the start of the pandemic, you wouldn't be dealing with this.
I didn't know this, but this reminds me of like global macroeconomics, sometimes economists talk about the resource curse, and they talk about how oil like ruins a lot of economies because the governments just get addicted to oil and they never develop a proper economy. Like, if you look at Saudi Arabia, they have oil and that's it. Yeah. So in a way, you're saying tourism is like that. You can get addicted to the tourism, and then the rest of your economy never develops properly.
Because tourism creates a lot of semi-skilled jobs. Okay, whether it's working in a hotel or as a driver or whatever, you don't need to be a brain surgeon to work in a hotel. So for destinations that don't have a lot of alternative jobs to offer, tourism is an easy fix. But the issue is, are these decent jobs? Are they coming with benefits? Is there security in there? Like that kind of thing needs to be considered. So like Greg was talking earlier about the overall tourism numbers, whatever the TAT is aiming for now, 40 million or whatever, the best thing that they could do would be to come out and say our target for 2025 is 12 million, right? And just cut it. And that's going to be some really hard times for a lot of businesses. But in taking that and then having a new baseline and working from there on a much more gradual plane, it means that these destinations are still going to be worth going to for like my kids or my kids' kids. But the way everything, like places like Hoi An or Luang Prabang or Chiang Mai even, the way that they were developing pre-pandemic, you consider that growth for another 10 years at that rate. I mean, do you still want to go there?
No.
No,
God, that'd be amazing. Can you know how like exclusivity makes something much more desirable, right? Can you imagine
Sure.
if Thailand said we've got 25 million tickets to come into the country?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, you'd have.
Well, I mean, very few countries do that. I mean,
That'd be
I know
crazy.
Bhutan. Bhutan is
Bhutan's
famous,
like the
but that's
famous
extreme.
one.
Right, but Bhutan is now like an aspirational destination for
Sure.
a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
I feel like Thailand could never do something like that.
I don't think so. No.
Realistic.
Well, they
interesting.
could.
Well, they could.
They could.
Interesting thought experiment.
This is the thing. It's all of this kind of stuff is driven by what's happening in 2 years' time. And particularly with climate change and what's going to happen in Thailand, they need to be thinking about a post-tourism Thailand in the south. So they've looked at the beach loss in Thailand that's going to happen over the next 80 years from rising sea levels. So in 80 years on the Andaman coast, they're looking at about 75% sand loss.
Whoa.
Wow.
Right? So would you go to Koh Lanta if there was no beaches?
Right. Of course not.
Yeah.
So it's people are like, oh, well, that's 80 years away. Who gives a shit? Who's going to be around? But it's not going to be totally normal for 79 years
Sure.
and then change.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
even in 20 years, we're going to be seeing serious changes. So the destinations need to be thinking about this. They need to be talking
Sure.
about it. And Thailand in particular isn't.
I wonder if I think we did talk about this before, but everyone talked about during COVID how GOPP kind of the coral reef like rebuilt itself, and and the Thai government seemed to be very aware that having no tourists was good for the environment. Like, I saw many stories about this. But do you think that, like, did they learn anything from that? It seems like you could, one thing that could work, like, since we're trying to be optimistic here, is maybe they could, pick an island that they close for a year. It's like they announce, like, okay, in 2026,
they rotate it.
Yeah, I mean, that seems not crazy, right?
Right.
Oh man, these are big ideas.
But I mean, because it was very good for PP to be closed.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Koh Phi Phi immediately after the tsunami. There was like 6 days or something after it, and it was horrific. But the silver lining of that was that, okay, well, in a way, you've got a blank slate.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, it's tragic, but there's an opportunity here because, like, before the tsunami, PP was a disaster area. To rebuild and do things differently. It was like a really once in a lifetime opportunity.
Right, a reset.
I mean, you look at a joint now,
Oh, really?
it's a freaking disaster.
Oh, really?
Back to where it was before.
This is Phi Don, not DiCaprio's beach, but I mean, coming to that on Phi Phi Lay, what do they call it, Maya Beach? That's been a really interesting one to watch because you have these two parties that want completely opposite things. So you want your boat drivers and that kind of stuff they're making the money ferrying all the tourists. They want to take as many people as possible. That's how they make a living. Fair enough. But then the people who want to protect the environment and that kind of thing, I say, okay, we've got to have a cap on it. So there is a middle ground. And they've been like trying to figure it out. But every time they came out with a number, and it was like, well, how are you actually going to manage that?
Yeah, right.
Are there any caps now? Do you know if there's any caps?
I'm
now?
not sure what the situation is.
The story kind of
now.
went away, didn't it? I haven't heard anything about it.
I saw a photo a couple of weeks ago of like a bazillion people on the beach again.
Oh, really?
Who knows?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But I think that, I'm not one to sort of say destinations should be priced out, like say the Bhutan approach. I don't agree with, but I totally agree with ticketing. So if some dude who's really into the natural environment here goes to Phi Phi Lay and says, okay, a sustainable number of people is whatever, let's say 100 people a day, just for argument's sake. This place cannot take more than that many people. So that's fine. That's what we do. there's 100 tickets a day. They're like 10 baht each or whatever. And so if you want to go, you're going to have to book that 6 months in advance.
Oh, I see. You're saying don't use market pricing. So, because if they reduce the number, then the price will go up. So you're saying set the price, set the number.
Price, just like a nominal charge, because the real benefit in the ticketing isn't the revenue. It's protecting the place for future generations. So they need to think about it that way. People book their flights a year in advance. They book their hotels a year in advance. Why can't they do this? And they totally could. It would be like, a very big adjustment for businesses and that kind of thing. But if you want to have something that your kids are going to be able to benefit from, you need to think a bit further in advance.
Yeah.
You know?
I sometimes cynically say that Thai bureaucrats and the people in charge would rather make 500 baht once than 100 baht 10 times.
I mean,
very nearsighted.
It's a common sentiment. I mean, I was in the Philippines late last year on a dive trip, and there's a particular place there that is fabulous for diving with sardines. Like, you're in a school of about 8 million fish. It's incredible. But the place is a mess. It's a complete disaster area. And so I was interviewing a dive master there, a European guy. And I'm like, well, what do you think about this? Like, this is a mess, you know? And he's like, he said, in 40 years, this will all be gone. So we make our money now, you know?
Right, but he's making it gone.
Yeah. And I mean, fish rots from the head, you know? But I think that isn't that uncommon an outlook. And for these islands in the south that are going to lose their beaches, should they maybe just make as much money as they can now, because in a decade's time they won't have a business anymore.
Speaking of that, I want to talk a little bit about sustainable tourism, and anyone who follows you on Threads or your newsletters, you've sort of pivoted to that over the past year or couple of years, and made that a real focus of the stuff you're trying to promote and investigate and write about. What's going on there? Is that sort of like the new thing, or are people really taking that into account now?
It's sort of. I was talking to someone recently about it, and they said, like, how were you traveling when you were 20 something? And I'm like, I didn't give a shit. You know, I didn't know anything about sustainability. I didn't know anything about carbon or flying too much or whatever.
Right.
I had no idea. So I'm a very late comer to the game. I was turned onto it through the pandemic and seeing the effect in Bali of what happened when everybody lost their livelihoods and there was no security blanket, no safety net. I went back to school, started my master's, and the more I read about it, the more I learned about it, the more people I talked to, the more I realized this is really, really important if we want to have destinations that are still worth going to in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. And so there's lots of different angles to it, but the core of sustainability is that it has three foundations, which are the environment, the economy, and society. So every bit of tourism, you sort of need to weigh up the pros and cons across those three things. So I sort of came away from thinking about this, and the way I look at it is, you know how there's that cliche that they have like a photo of an untouched beach and some footprints, and it says like leave only footprints or something like that. Thinking about that cliche, and the way I think about it is that it doesn't matter how you travel. It doesn't matter what kind of travel you're doing. Every step of that journey, you can take it in a way that has a more positive effect and less negatives. Everything. And so it becomes a case of like analyzing your travel behaviors and sort of saying, well, what do I do? You know, do I eat at imported restaurants and imported food and wine? Do I fly all the time? Do I stay in luxury hotels? Like all of these different things. And I'm not saying that we all should like step back and just walk everywhere and stay in a cave, you know, but again, there's like a middle ground.
Right.
Man, it was great seeing him post-COVID. First time I've seen him in a couple of years. And things have changed. Like your intro said it. Like we were talking about over tourism, and then bam, all of a sudden tourism went to basically zero.
Right. Yeah, it was crazy. We had no idea what was coming, did we? We were all young and optimistic back then in 2018.
That is right. And a lot has happened. So, we made it through COVID, and then now we're roughly about 2 years out, and things are recovering. And it was just great to get a professional person's take instead of just relying on my random musings.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear his insights. Always good stuff.
I was just checking the tourism numbers for 2024, and they're pretty damn good. So I just found an article that came out April 2nd, and it says in the first 3 months, Thailand has received over 9.37 million foreign tourists, which is a 44% increase from 2023. That's insane.
40% already from all of 2023.
No, 40% more than the first quarter.
The same period last year.
Yeah. Which is a pretty huge increase year on year.
Yeah, that is pretty huge. That's good. But, and like I mentioned during the interview as well, like I really think, and it's so hard to do. It's so hard to do with any business, because I understand you want to make money, but like restricting access to a lot of these things, selling like limited amounts of tickets to attractions and things like that. Right. I think that would go a long way to that would be soft power, that would just increase the desirability of a lot of these places if only X tickets were available. And sorry, you can't do it. You got to come back next week or whatever.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. Just like, we talked about it in the interview. The overall number of tourists, it's such an easy number to use, but there are just downsides to just focusing on growth, as we talked about.
Yeah, it's a bit sad to just see the growth at all costs thing, because we know what comes of it. We know what comes of overdevelopment and environmental degradation and, hotels that are poorly designed and quickly built and don't take into account, quality. It's just about getting as many people through as quickly as possible, which is a bit of a bummer. But man, I just quickly looked up the tourism numbers going back. Well, this site has them going back to 1995. In 1995, they were about 7 million.
Interesting. And this year, and this year's projecting 35.
35, from 7 to 35 million. Man, it must have been a very different landscape back then.
Man, I wish I went back then. I mean, you and I have had plenty of longtime expats, and their stories about the 90s and even the 80s are crazy.
Yeah, no doubt. I was just out of high school. It would have been a different world, man. But yeah, thanks, Stu, for coming on. Always a pleasure to chat to you and see what's going on around Asia. You're a good voice to talk to about that. And anyone, if you don't know travelfish.org, head over there right now, sign up for the newsletter. Really good stuff comes out every week. And we'll be back next week to talk to Stu for part 2.
For sure. Thanks, Stu.
All right, let's do something we call Would You Rather, where one of us picks 2 contrasting situations tied to Thailand to debate and choose which one we'd prefer. Ed, this week I got something for you.
Alrighty.
Now, this one's going to require a bit of a hypothetical on your part. You're going to have to imagine something for me. I want you to imagine.
I'm good at that. I'm good at imagining stuff.
You are good at imagining stuff. I want you to imagine that you are a tour guide. You're a professional tour guide.
Okay.
Right? You love showing people around. Now, I did some Googling around here about Cleveland.
Uh-oh.
And it said here that probably the most popular tourist attraction in Cleveland is the Cleveland Museum of Art.
Interesting. Oh, I have another theory of what it would have been, but why don't you continue?
Okay. Well, I was going to say, if you had to be a tour guide for a year, would you rather be a tour guide at the Cleveland Museum of Art or the Grand Palace?
Ooh, yeah, this is a weird question.
It is a weird question.
Let me make my point. I would have thought that Cleveland's #1 tourist attraction was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is the Cleveland Museum of Art. That's possible. We have a good museum of art back home, along with a good orchestra and a really good hospital, by the way. So I don't know why I'm going on a.
I'm not sure how many tourists go to hospitals.
I'm going on a Cleveland like marketing rant.
Right.
But wow. So it's funny because I museums are things that I don't go to enough, and I kind of regret it, because when I go, I usually appreciate it. But
Same.
I've said on the podcast before that I'm just not a big temple guy, or I'm kind of the type of person who would go to a temple once, or I'd find the most photogenic temple and go there, once and take a bunch of pictures. And then I feel like I don't need to go to temples anymore.
Right.
So in this case, I would, because normally I think I would much rather be a tour guide in Thailand than in Cleveland, Ohio. Like
well, that's the thing, right? Like it's much more interesting, right?
But the way you framed it as like a museum in Cleveland versus the Grand Palace. I mean, the Grand Palace is cool, but I'm really not a temple guy. And like the Cleveland Museum of Art is awesome. Like it's legit, world-class museum. I don't know if it's not, I mean, our orchestra is in the top 10. The Cleveland Clinic is probably the second best hospital. So the Museum of Art is up there. It might sound weird, but I'm just really not a temple guy. I'm gonna go Cleveland Museum of Art.
All right, fair enough.
Because I'm kind of I feel guilty that I don't go to museums more, but I don't feel guilty when I skip a temple.
That could come back to haunt you when you're burning in hell.
That's right. Correct. Absolutely correct.
All right. Well, Cleveland. If you're going to Cleveland, just email Ed for some tips on the museum. He'll send those your way.
Yeah. Well, rock and roll. We got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and that's.
I didn't want to choose the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because obviously, who wouldn't love to do that more than the Grand Palace? No offense to the Grand Palace, but come on.
Right. Yeah, that would have been too easy.
Yeah. But you're going to be looking at paintings for an entire year, going, and this painting was done in 1922. Anyway, you're a tour guide at the museum. Have fun with that. Good one.
All righty. All right, a final thanks to our patrons who support the show. Patrons get a ton of cool perks and the warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that they're helping in our never-ending quest for cool content. Find out more by clicking support on our website. And connect with us online. We're Bangkok Podcast on social media, bangkokpodcast.com on the web, or simply bangkokpodcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from our listeners and always reply to our messages.
That's right. You can also listen to each episode on YouTube. You can send us a voicemail through our website that we'll feature on the show. Hit me up on threads at BKKGreg. Thank you for listening, everyone. Take it easy out there. Stay cool. And we will see you back here next week.
No doubt. On this week's bonus show, we chatted about the shit. Sorry, weed hack.
That's funny.